Hi guys, let's talk about chapter 3, starting on page 65. We're going to talk about all of the cycles. These cycles are very, very important for the AP test. You have to know them backwards and forwards and what happens when humans mess with the cycle. So make sure you study these and you know these cold. Okay? So matter cycles through the biosphere. Remember, the biosphere is all of the ecosystems, everything that's living. The biosphere goes from the top of Mount Everest down to the bottom of the deepest ocean, so that's about 12 miles thick on the Earth. All these cycles we're going to talk about are called biogeochemical cycles because they cycle between living and non-living places on the Earth, and it has to do with biology, geology, and chemistry. You know chemistry. I love chemistry. That's my favorite part. So let's move on. So we're going to talk about the hydrologic cycle. Remember not to call it the water cycle. They do not like that on the AP test. So call it the hydrologic cycle. Hydro meaning water and going through a cycle. So talk about that. So it's essentially how water goes from different places on the Earth. And we've got, let's do step 1. Step 1 is when the sun's heat heats up the water and causes evaporation off of the lakes. And also you're going to have evaporation and transpiration when plants give off water when they're doing their living cycle. You're going to have transpiration. So evapotranspiration is all of the water that's evaporated from the surface of the earth and also transpired from plants. Evapotranspiration. Okay. The second part of the cycle is when all that evaporated water decides to condense, go from the gas phase into the liquid phase in clouds. So clouds are little tiny droplets of water all massed together. That's the second part of the cycle. So first part of the cycle we had evaporation from soil, from lakes, and from evapotranspiration from plants. And all that water is now in clouds because it's condensed into clouds. And then when there's enough water all together in one cloud and the conditions are right, then that water is going to change from a cloud form into precipitation, which is rain or snow or sleet. Any water falling from the sky is precipitation. And then last, the precipitation that falls on the land is taken up by plants. Some of it's going to run off along the land surface, and some's going to percolate into the soil and enter the groundwater system. So that's the hydrologic cycle. And people mess with that cycle, and you'll need to know that for the AP test by, for example, clear cutting a whole big giant forest area, and then instead of water being able to go back into the aquifers and the groundwater, then the water is just going to run straight off and go into lakes and rivers and into the ocean. And when they do that, they're going to carry a bunch of soil, which is going to mess with the soil layer. They're going to carry a bunch of chemicals into the water, and that's going to mess with the biology of those areas there. So AP tests, they're going to ask you about, you're going to need to know the cycle cold, know it completely, and then they're going to want to know what happens when people mess with the cycle. So every cycle that we talk about, try to think of ways that people mess with the cycle. That's called the anthropogenic change. Anthro meaning man. So here's the steps of the hydrologic cycle. We've got transpiration, which comes from plants. We have evaporation, which is going liquid to gas phase from any water that's on the land. Runoff is when water moves across the land surface, and that happens a lot when you mess with the normal land surface by changing the plant communities. You know, more runoff. Precipitation is any water falling from the sky, and infiltration is important because this gives us all of the water that we use for drinking water. So infiltration is when water goes through the pores in the soil and accumulates in aquifers in the groundwater. Next, we're going to talk about the carbon cycle. Carbon cycle is complicated So you'll need to know this one as well. And you can have living parts to it and non-living parts to it. So let's talk about each section. Let's talk about, you know that producers, which are plants, autotrophs, convert carbon dioxide into sugar. So that's one step of the system. Those sugars are eaten by animals, and then that carbon is converted from sugar back into carbon dioxide. So that's that little part of the cycle. So photosynthesis is when you're making glucose and you're reducing CO2 out of the air, and then when consumers eat the sugars, then the sugars convert back to CO2. That's one part of the cycle. So that's photosynthesis versus respiration. Sometimes carbon on the surface of the earth can be buried underneath the earth, and then you'll have like fossilization of animals and plants. When you get enough of that, that will turn into fossil fuels. Humans mess with the carbon cycle by extracting the fossil fuels and burning them. So the fossil fuels are long chains of carbon, and once you burn them with oxygen, then you make carbon dioxide. So that's why we're having troubles with global warming, because we're adding way too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than normal, than the Earth can normally handle. Another part of the carbon cycle is when you have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere dissolves in water, and that's then some of the carbon dioxide dissolved in water comes back out into the air. So that happens a lot in the ocean. And last but not least, you have combustion of the fossil fuels that converts fossil fuels into carbon dioxide again. So that's the carbon cycle in a nutshell. And we'll talk about ways that humans can mess with it. Remember, humans mess with the cycle by burning fossil fuels, also by causing fires, and when you have a fire, it's going to produce carbon dioxide. So those are a couple of ways that humans can change the carbon cycle. Always keep in mind that we have to think about the way humans change the cycle for the AP tests. So here's the carbon cycle in a nutshell. Remember, carbon is the building block of living things, and I was looking for the percentage, but it's a big percentage of living things. 20% of the total body weight of living things is carbon. We talked about producers get carbon and they mix from atmospheric CO2 and they make it into sugars. Consumers do the opposite, and carbon dioxide gas is recycled into the atmosphere when these things die. Sometimes organisms can be fossilized in sediments, and that gives us fossil fuels. Those are all things that are living parts of the cycle. We have things that are the non-living parts of the cycle when you have carbon dioxide gets mixed into the ocean and then gets re-released back into the atmosphere. We have excess carbon in ocean animals and plants that go into sediments and become fossil fuels again later on. And then occasionally you're going to have big chunks of under ocean sediments being lifted up by plate tectonics, and then you will have those carbon sediments being exposed to the air, and then they become CO2. So that's due to weathering of rocks from plant-based rocks, sedimentary rocks that are lifted up during the tectonic cycle. Okay, nitrogen cycle is really complicated, and we'll talk about that next. So let's look at all the parts. We have 5 major parts. We have one called nitrogen fixation, and that's when atmospheric N2, which is N hooked to another N, triple bonded, it's converted to ammonia or to NO3, which is ammonia or nitrate, generally by bacteria. And lots of times on the land, there's really cool plants that allow nitrogen-fixing bacteria to live within their roots in big nodules, or big parts of their roots, and it's a symbiotic relationship. So the plants get the nitrogen from the bacteria, and the bacteria get sugars from the plant. So it's a really cool system, and we would not be able to have any living plants on the earth if we didn't have this bacteria symbiotic system. Another part of the nitrogen cycle is called assimilation, and producers take up ammonia or nitrate, and they use the nitrogen to form parts of their structure. So remember that nitrogen is part of proteins in plants and animals. Ammonification is when decomposers in the soil, they break down a plant or an animal, and ammonium NH4+ is formed. Nitrification is done by bacteria. They take the ammonium they find and they turn it into nitrite, and then they add another oxygen and form nitrate. So nitrite is NO2 - 1, nitrate is NO3 - 1. And then last but not least, we have denitrification, and this is where bacteria, in places where there's not a lot of oxygen, so they need that oxygen, so they take the NO3 and they change it to N2O, so they get a couple of oxygens out of the deal when they make N2O and nitrogen. So they decompose NO3 because they want the oxygen, and they give off N2 back again, and then the cycle starts all over again. So that's the nitrogen cycle. Humans can mess with it by changing what's happening with the soil. So, for example, if they clear cut a forest, then water is going to, instead of trickling down into the ground, it's going to leach the nitrogen into nearby streams and rivers. Humans can also add a whole bunch of fertilizer to a particular farm field, and then if they add too much, that nitrogen is going to wash off, it's going to leach off and go into rivers and streams and mess with the biology of the rivers and streams. So that's called leaching. Leaching is when nitrogen is transported through soil and water. That's called leaching. So adding too much nitrogen can really mess up a particular ecosystem. They found that if they add nitrogen to a particular ecosystem, that it reduces the number, the kinds of species that live there. So adding too much nitrogen is not a good thing. Now we have to be careful. Humans have to be careful about not adding too much. So here's the steps of the nitrogen cycle. Remember, it's an important macronutrient. Macro means great, a big nutrient that we need, and it's in proteins and DNA and RNA. It's a limiting producer, which means that if you do not have enough nitrogen in the soil, then you cannot have enough growth of the plant. We have nitrogen fixation, so make sure you know that. And you also have denitrifying bacteria, nitrifying and denitrifying. So we have to know the difference between the two. Okay, phosphorus is another important chemical for plants and animals. It's a major component of DNA, RNA, and ATP. And remember, ATP is the energy using chemical in the body of plants and animals. So it's used for energy transfer. So let's talk about the steps for the phosphorus cycle. Let's see. Step 1 would be where we're weathering rocks that have been uplifted by the tectonic cycle, and they contain phosphates. Those phosphates are then going to leach their way onto the land and then into the ocean. So phosphate rocks being weathered are going to allow phosphates to be released. Another part is where you apply phosphate fertilizer into fields and it runs directly into the streams. It becomes part of a soil pool, or it can be absorbed by plants. Another part is where Plants and animals excrete phosphorus. It's released into the land or into the water. When those excretions of phosphates occur, however they get into the water, then those things can precipitate out of the water and make ocean sediments, and then turn into those rocks that are going to contain phosphates. And those sediments, after millions of years or whatever happens, whenever the uplift happens because of the tectonic cycle, then you have rocks being slowly lifted, and they contain phosphate, and then we start the process all over again of weathering those rocks. So here's the phosphorus cycle again. There's no gas phase of phosphorus in any part of the cycle. Remember, we had nitrogen being gas, water being gas, but there's no gas parts for phosphorus. It always stays as a solid in whatever chemical form it's in. It's not soluble in water, so phosphorus is another limiting nutrient like nitrogen. If you don't have enough of it, you cannot grow plants or animals. It enters the system by uplift and erosion, weathering of phosphate-containing rocks. They enter the surface water and then are assimilated. That means plants take them up and use them. And then consumers eat plants. And then animals and plants die or excrete that phosphorus. And then those sediments are turned into rocks again. So it's a slow cycle. Now, sulfur cycle. Let me get there. Sulfur has a big, giant set of parts to its cycle. We have a human-made sulfur dioxide that gets into the atmosphere. We have H2S that's formed naturally. We have those things can just fall down onto the earth again and then be recycled. We also have wet deposition, where these gases meet with water and then they turn into acid rain or acid snow, and then those sulfates go into the water. So this is a complicated system. We'll talk about more about it in class, so I can get can help you understand all these parts. But there's quite a bit to this part. You can also have H2S coming out of volcanoes. So we'll talk about this one. And humans mess with the cycle by burning fuels that have sulfur in them and making H2S or H2SO4, and then we get acid rain. So the human part of this is acid rain. So here's the sulfur cycle again. We have sulfur is used in cell processes, and some organisms use sulfur instead of oxygen. Like in Yellowstone, they have the cool hot geysers, and there's actually even in the depths of the ocean where the vents are, they have cool bacteria that take the sulfur. Instead of using oxygen, they use sulfur for electron transfer. We have a lot of sulfur in rocks that's the form of FeS and sulfates, and they're dissolved by surface water, and then the water goes to plants. Plants assimilate the sulfate, and then consumers eat the plants and they get the sulfur. And then when these plants and animals die, then they release the sulfur back into water and into H2S. And there we go. So know those parts. So these are things to remember for the AP test. How do humans mess with these cycles? For example, we use all these things in fertilizers, and if you add too much, it's going to change the whole cycle and change how, especially when these things get into water, it messes with the biology of those places. So if you add too much nitrogen, you're going to get algae blooming, too much algae in a system, And when you have too much algae in a system, then it takes up all the oxygen when it respires, and then all the animals and fish are going to die. So that happens with phosphorus. It also happens with nitrogen and phosphorus. So that's why they limited detergents back a while back to get rid of phosphates out of detergent, because it was messing with the algae in particular areas and killing fish. So those are human things that we have messed with the ecosystem. So again, we've used detergents in phosphates in detergents, and it's messed with streams and lakes. We burn fossil fuels, and that changes these cycles. We get sulfur as acid rain. We get nitrogen. We make acid rain, and carbon. The carbon cycle is changed because it's the fossil fuels are used out of the depths of underneath the earth. When we urbanize, which means when we put a bunch of houses and streets and business offices in a particular area, then we cover over the surface of the earth, and the water cannot percolate down into the aquifers. So then we have less drinking water in that particular area. So that's a bad thing that we do. People also deforest areas. That's the beginning of chapter 3. They talk about that in Haiti, where people are so poor they need to have all the forests. They need to cut down the forest to use it for fuel. But when they do that, they change how water percolates down into the soil, and water it can't percolate. It just runs straight off into the rivers, and then when it does, it carries a bunch of these things with it, and so it changes all the cycles when you deforest. And then mining, we're changing the cycles by bringing the sulfur up faster than normal, or phosphorus faster than the earth normally does. So those are human changes to the cycles, and you should know this for the AP test. So what's the big deal? Well, these are the human things that we can do to mess with the cycles. I just talked about the extra water runoff. We burn fossil fuels, so we make too much greenhouse gas, so our temperature of our earth is going up. When we use too much nitrogen, it kills the diversity of a particular area and kills plants that are adapted to low nitrogen levels. And then you have a whole bunch of one kind of plant that can survive nitrogen, and all these other kind of plants are killed off. When we have too much phosphorus, we make algae blooms, and then we kill a bunch of aquatic organisms. And we have too much sulfur in the air, then we change the pH of rainfall, and then we have acid rain and kill a bunch of animals in aquatic organisms in lakes and streams. So these are all the things that humans can do, and so it's good to remember these for the AP test. So when we're talking about the AP test, and you need to think about this, you need to know why each substance is important. Why each substance is important to life. So what it's used for in life. So remember, nitrogen is for proteins. Phosphorus is for energy. Remember those things that we talked about? And then what humans have done to disturb the cycle. Specific examples. Don't say in general, oh, we just let a lot of nitrogen go all different places and things happen. That's not very specific. You have to say, for example, when we use too much nitrogen fertilizer on a cornfield, then the nitrogen, if we use more than the plants can absorb, then some of it's going to run off into streams. When it runs off into streams, then it causes these specific problems. So be very, very specific when you talk about these things on the AP test. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and I'll talk to you soon. Stop. I will talk to you soon about all these things in class. We'll go over these very, very specifically and in good detail, and then we'll do some labs about it as well. So I'll talk to you about the rest of chapter 3 in the next screencast I make. Okay, I'll talk to you soon.